just about to talk you through some basic principles when it comes to pruning fruit trees. Just done this exact tutorial over on TikTok. I've done exactly the same tutorial over on Instagram. So it's your turn now. I'm about to prune this 5-tiered Espalier James Grieve apple, which is a really, really lovely apple. Very, very firm fleshed. It stores really well. A really lovely apple for keeping and enjoying, maybe with some mature cheddar or Plowman's, that type of thing. Very sharp and very, very firm flesh. I want to talk you through the basic principles of pruning first. First of all, if you have an apple, a pear, a plum, any one of those trees and they're freestanding, I want to impart some knowledge into you. You don't need to prune your tree unless there is a problem. They're absolutely fine all by themselves. You don't need to go over and do this kind of pruning. This kind of pruning technique is really now really focused on creating as much fruit in as small amounts of space when you're training a fruit tree like the one behind me. But if you have a freestanding apple, pear, plum, all of those types of things growing in your garden, and it is absolutely fine, you don't need to do anything with it whatsoever. It will grow, it will fruit, it will reach maturity, and unless you have any of the following issues, you don't need to do anything with it at all. All you need to identify is whether you have any dead, diseased, dying, or most importantly with fruit trees, any crossing stems. If you have any of those items, if you have a dead wood or dying wood, if you have any crossing stems, diseased wood, you need to remove that back, and you need to remove that to healthy growth. If you have inherited a particularly large apple or pear tree, for instance, that might be a bit unruly, if you've taken on an overgrown allotment or moved into a house where you have a mature fruit tree that might have got a bit out of hand, please bear in mind some basic principles. You should never ever remove more than 1/3 of the growth in any one season. That includes the following. So if you need to work on the canopy and bring the tree back into balance, if it's reaching a certain direction for light, or if it's just too big for the space and you want to thin it back, please don't remove more than 1/3 of the canopy, which must be done when the plant is actually dormant. So during the winter months, anywhere from here in the UK, that goes from anywhere from late November all the way through to the end of February into the beginning of March, when the plant is completely and utterly dormant. The sap is down and the plant is asleep and resting. Now, this maximum of 1/3 that you can remove, unfortunately, includes the following. If you have a congested tree with lots and lots of growth crossing in the center, that needs to be opened up. There are videos here on YouTube of me doing that exact process, so please do just type that into your search bar, have a look at that and follow the tutorials there. But if you have very much similar to any fruit bush or a rose, you don't want the center of the plant, as in the center of the tree, to be congested. You want plenty of light, air and a circulation there to get rid of moisture and make sure lots of air is in there. You don't get pests and disease problems like canker and fire blight that you might do on apples and pears. So no more than 1/3 of growth to be removed on an annual basis if you have heavy work to do on a tree. But if you have a freestanding apple, pear or plum, there's absolutely no reason whatsoever it should need any pruning. Unless it's getting a little bit out of hand, you can nibble off the bits and bring it back into shape. This particular tutorial, now we've waffled on for about 3 or 4 minutes, is actually about trained fruit trees. And we train fruit trees to a really, really good reason, exactly the same as we would do if we were growing wall-trained roses. Incidentally, a little bit of information for you: no rose is ever born as a climbing rose. Climbing roses are just large shrubs that we train into different positions and make them behave differently because of the way we train them. They're just larger shrubs that we just train. The idea of bringing the stems into the horizontal position, like with this Espalier tree behind me, it's a 5-tier one, is to slow the sap down. And we do this with fruit trees in several different ways. Espalier, which is bringing the branches down into the horizontal position, 90 degrees to the ground, or we can cordon a plant, which is normally grown as one singular stem from a rootstock, and these are normally planted at 45 degrees. They look like they've all fallen over. You can pack lots of plants into a garden space, either against a wall or maybe as a freestanding hedge or something like that. You could also fan train trees, where you bring their branches at 45-degree angles and make them look decorative on walls. And the last, but by no means least, the step over, which is normally around an 18-inch graft bent at 90-degree angles, normally planted against a path or an avenue for you to step over, for instance, into a vegetable patch, very popular on allotments. All of the principles of training fruit trees are exactly the same. By training them 90 degrees or training them in 45 degrees, we slow the sap down in the plant. And by doing that, we actually slow the hormones down in the plant as well, and they linger. at different positions. So I haven't got a piece of growth that I'll get one for you in a minute. But same as a rose, when you bring the stems down into a 45-degree angle and train them onto a wall, you slow the sap in the plant down. Obviously, the plant is full of highways that bring water, sap, and starches from the roots up into the leaves. They're photosynthesized, and then they create starches and sugars which feed the plant, and in turn, obviously, flowers and fruits. By slowing that sap down, it lingers at the bud points. It lingers at the place where there are nodules and growth points. And in doing that, you increase the hormone levels at those positions, and you increase flowering and ultimately fruiting. So what we do when we train a fruit tree like this, we brought the branches down into a 90-degree position to grow as much fruit as possible in a smaller space as possible. So this kind of fruit tree is really, really good for a modern garden these days as our plot size starts to shrink. Most people don't have the room that I've got here at North Lodge. We've got quite a large plot. I'm very lucky, but I've got half a dozen of these dotted about the garden. This one is in actually quite a funny location. Most people are quite confused by this one, but it was put here for a very, very good reason. But by creating things like this, we can actually create outdoor screens, we can cover walls, but more importantly, we can create an awful lot more fruit growth in a very, very small area. But it requires quite a lot of maintenance. It requires us to train the plant and look after it in a certain way. There are two ways and two different applications the plant needs on an annual basis. It needs summer pruning. This is normally carried out around late July into August, and we summer prune just like we would do a wisteria to encourage the plant to set wood and start setting buds for next year. We also fruit prune during the summer months to actually remove quite an awful lot of the growth to allow light and air into the plant, and most importantly sun into the plant, so it actually has a chance of ripening the crop that it's bearing. We then, during the winter months, remove all of the excess growth, and we actually prune it to encourage it to produce lots more horns, or spurs as they're called. You can see this plant here covered in little tiny spurs all the way along its branches, each one of those with dozens of buds on them, producing flowers and ultimately fruit in a smaller space as possible. I'm going to try, if I can, bear with me a second, I'm going to nip away for a moment. I actually had a bit of growth. Where has it gone? I don't want to cut another bit off. I will have to cut, I'll come back to it. But yeah, what we want to do is we now want to remove the growth wherever possible. I'm going to bring you nice and close, and you'll be able to see what I've been doing. You can see this particular tree is actually trained onto a series of wires. And at this point in time, what we want to do is we want to make sure we go over these wires and make sure that these are really, really loose. Don't allow these to bite into the bark, otherwise they will cause points of damage and ultimately points of disease if you get to that point. You don't want them to be biting into the bark and actually marking the bark, otherwise they will damage them. But you can see on this particular stem here, I'm going to have to bring you in close. I'm not going to have to see you for a second, so do excuse me while I point. You can see this particular stem, I've pruned this on several different occasions. This was the winter prune last year, creating 2 buds, and this was the fruit bud that we left. This was the growth produced during the summer, and this is where I've pruned it to during the summer months to remove the excess growth. So this piece is the old bit, and this is all new growth produced after the summer pruning. What we now want to do is I'm going to cut this off, and it's going to make me feel sick. But I'll tell you what, let's do this one up here. Got plenty of growth up here. I'm going to stand back from the camera so I can show you. What we now want to do is select an outward-facing fruit bud, if at all possible. Look, I've sacrificed this for you guys. We select an outward-facing bud on all fruit trees and all roses wherever possible to ensure that the plant continues to grow in an outward-facing fashion, to make sure that it actually naturally creates a nice, pleasing, well-balanced shape. So again, when it comes to carrying fruit, it's not all lolloped off to one side. The growth is all growing 365 degrees around the plant, and more importantly, it grows away from the central port of the plant, making sure there's lots of light and airflow in the center of the plant. Many people will tell you not to bother with this. Many people say this is not important, but I've been gardening for a very, very long time. 30 years I've been doing this. I have a horticultural degree. I've worked on many stately homes and large gardens, very important horticultural sites. This is really very important. You will alleviate an awful lot of the problems you will encounter if you just focus on your technique. And I don't want to sound preachy at you. I don't want to say you must do, because it's your garden, it's your rules. But by just slowing the process down and following the process, you will actually alleviate an awful lot of the problems. So during this process, you can see what I've done is I've removed this to actually show you. We're now looking for an outward facing fruit bud Fruit buds on apples, pears, and plums are normally produced low down on the growth. They're normally produced very, very early on in the season before. So these buds would have actually been set by the plant, starting to think about actually putting them away, normally in about March or April of last year. Now they've overwintered, they're ready to fruit. The buds higher up, the younger buds, are actually leaf buds. And the difference between a leaf bud, you can see, if I bring this close into the camera, leaf bud is really, really very flat and very pointy. You'll see almost silver in its color. It lays flat against the stem. A fruit bud will bulge underneath the surface of the bark. There's one there, there's another one there, really, really large. If I run my finger across it, you'll see it moving. Really, really large bump there. And the fruit bud is bumpy because there's a huge amount of packed underneath the bark. The flowers are already there. They're already tucked up within that bud, ready to unfurl and ready to grow. So by cutting the stems off in, say, late July, you force this plant to actually overwinter and actually start, or over summer, sorry, to actually start setting wood. We've actually pruned this to about 5 to 7 buds during the summer, much as we would do a wisteria, allowing the plant to focus its attention on these 5 to 7 buds. And what we do during the winter months is remove all of this excess growth. And what we're going to do now with our very, very sharp, clean and sanitized secateurs is we're going to find an outward facing bud. Imagine this is our outward facing fruit bud. We're going to create a 45-degree cut and we are going to remove the excess growth, leaving just 1, 2 or 3 buds left on the plant. Over a period of time, this is going to create a plant that is absolutely smothered in spurs or fruit horns, as we call them. A lot of people say, Ben, you're removing an awful lot of the growth. It would produce an awful lot more flowers. It would produce an awful lot more fruit if you left those buds on. Short of it is, yes, it would do. But we're focusing on quality fruit that the plant has the ability to carry with this. If you allow your plants to carry too much fruit, you will end up with the same problem. I did this as on a live on TikTok a couple of days ago, earlier in the morning. And the question came through about why I was doing this and why we're removing so much bud and so many potential points of flowering of course fruit. And then rebuffed the person that asked the question and said, right, your fruit trees, do they actually fruit? They said, well, no, it sets loads and loads of fruit, gets to about June or very, very early July, and all of the fruit falls to the floor. It does that because the plant is actually stressed. It doesn't have the ability to actually carry the crop. And all it wants to do is produce enough fruit for it to be able to set seed and reproduce. And obviously it only needs 1 or 2 fruits to be able to do that. For a horse or a cow, for instance, to come along and eat and take away and dump somewhere else for a new tree to grow. However, in the garden, we want the plant to be able to carry as much fruit as at all possible. And I, as a gardener, or you following along at home, need to make the decision for the plant. Otherwise, all it will do is it gets stressed as soon as it starts to get warm, whenever your summer may arrive, and it will literally get stressed and drop all of its fruit, normally when they're the size of a ping pong ball or a golf ball, something along that line. So what we do is we create as much potential for points of fruit as possible. And then in around late May, once the fruit is actually set, we actually go over the plant and we thin those back and we lose almost 2/3 of the crop. This espalier tree behind me is a 5-tier plant. It was actually brought with us from our last house. This particular plant was bought at around 8 to 10 years old, and I've had it for around 10 years. So it's about 20 years old it's coming on for now. This particular plant last year produced around 16 kilos of apples, vast quantity of apples. And we're talking like a bucket full like this of apples, dozens and dozens, probably about 6 dozen apples, loads and loads of fruit in a really, really small space. So it's up to you to use your secateurs. You're the trainer to actually prune the plant and actually make the right decisions for it. So we're going to go over this plant now. I'm going to do this 1 or 2 more times before we wrap up today's live. I'm going to be difficult for me to see. Right, so you can see on this particular piece of growth, this is where the cut was made to last year. This is the spur that we contained 2 buds from last year. This is last year's fruit bud, now producing a spur all of its own. This was the cut I made, and this was the one I made during the summer months when we knuckled this back to a couple of buds. And now I'm going to, with my secateurs, 45-degree angle, again leaving around 5 to 7 millimeters between the anvil of the secateur and the blade. I'm simply going to remove all of that growth to an outward facing fruit bud, and we do a 45-degree angle cut to ensure that the water runs off of the plant and doesn't cause a point of rot. So we're going to do that again for you. Let's see if we can find another bit for you to do. This particular tree is a little on the tall side, so I tell you what, why don't we actually take the tripod up because I've got the ability to do that with this particular one. I've got my tripod out today. Let's take you up. Bear with me a second. There we go. We've got a little bit of height on you now. And once again, you can see the tree trained through here. These are the spurs. This was the cut from last year. And all I'm going to do now is selecting an outward facing bud. I'm going to take my secateurs at a 45-degree angle and remove all of this excess whippy growth. I'm going to go over the whole plant and do the exact same thing. Nice and sleek. This will then end up looking really, really tidy, and it's not a particularly nice phrase I like using in the garden. I don't really like using the words tidy and clean, because gardens are never tidy and they are never clean. However, when it comes to fruit and roses, your structures need to be sleek, they need to be clean, and they need to be tidy. So at this time of year, it's a really good idea to get out and prune any trained fruit trees, whether it's pot grown or in the ground. If you're growing espalier, fan trained, cordon, or step over plants, it's a great way of getting lots more fruit into the plant and removing all of this excess growth. Right, I'm going to wrap up today's live. I'm going to crack on and get some music on in my headphones and prune this before it rains again, because the weather has been absolutely atrocious. I will be back with you in a few days to carry on my pruning tutorials. We've done budlias and we've done sambucas so far. We have done apples and pears and plums, and we are going to be moving on to, over the next few days, soft fruits like red and black currants, and also gooseberries. I should be pruning those for you as well. Lots of those here in the garden. So do enjoy yourselves out in the garden. I will see you all again very soon. Take care now. Bye bye now.